All right. Thank you, Alfred and Agnes, for introducing us and the study that we did. So let me just jump in with some of the findings. The study itself was called "Partners in Need, Partners Indeed: Tracking Europe-Taiwan Relations Amidst Global Disruption," and that is kind of the framing that we did for the whole study. But before I start, let me maybe introduce our institute a little bit more. Central European Institute of Asian Studies is a think tank originally founded in Slovakia, in Bratislava, but nowadays also with quite a presence in Vienna, thanks to Alfred and his team here, but also in Prague, with where some of our colleagues are based. We conduct research and advocacy on many different issues related to Europe's relations with the Indo-Pacific region, EU-Taiwan relations being one of the key pillars there, which led us in 2022, due to the increasing demand for understanding Taiwan and making sure how to navigate the relationship, to starting our EU-Taiwan Center within a CEIAS, where we've conducted many different projects. Alfred mentioned some of those, but really the flagship project we have is the EU Taiwan Tracker, a interactive database that we are running containing data since 2019. Which is updated maybe every 2-3 weeks on what is happening on the bilateral level between individual EU member states and Taiwan, which is also the data that has fed into producing this paper that we are discussing today. This was a first of its kind systematic tracking of European states' ties with Taiwan using a bottom-up approach. So looking at every single European Union member state and plus those three others on their own individual merit, looking at the bilateral relations rather than amalgamating them into the single European whole that we sometimes see when papers on Europe-Taiwan are produced. Of course, that approach also has its merits, but we wanted to see really on what's going on the individual state level, so we can also compare and understand whether individual countries deviate in their approach and how their approaches are individual evolving, and whether we see some commonality in the trajectory that's coming up. So we were looking at not just political relations, but also economic cooperation, also subnational ties, people-to-people contacts, and academic exchanges, because this is a multi-layered relationship, and we need to understand the patterns in each of those layers to have a holistic picture of how the relationship is evolving. So since we are we ran this analysis for the paper based on the tracker, we have the good fortune of being able to also quantify the relationship, not just looking at the relationship from a qualitative perspective. And if we look at this from the longitudinal perspective, since 2019, so the last pre-pandemic year, we've seen the volume of engagements skyrocket, really. Between 2019 and 2024, we see essentially a five-fold increase in the volume of engagement. So meetings, MOUs being signed, various other forms of bilateral interaction that we are looking at in the tracker. Naturally, Europe is a heterogeneous region, so not all countries engage with Taiwan equally. We see different countries having very different appetites for engagement, very different levels of risk appetite when it comes to potential coercion from China, for example, due to pursuing the ties. And what we are seeing is that, of course, a lot of the relations are driven directly on the EU level, especially due to activity of the members of the European Parliament. But even that in and of itself is a fairly recent development, since only the very first official delegation out of the EU Parliament to Taiwan happened only in 2021. The delegation of the subcommittee on FIMI and hybrid warfare and threats to democracy. Besides the EU Parliament and other EU institutions, the most active countries in that time frame of 2019 to 2024 were Czech Republic, Lithuania, Germany, France, Slovakia, and Poland. If we look at also potential trajectories of how the relationship is very probably going to evolve in the future, in the next 5 years, we've seen that there are preconditions in most countries for continued engagement, And in only two countries, we currently decided to evaluate the relationship as having a negative outlook, that being Hungary and Slovakia. The Slovak case is quite interesting, right? Because on one hand, we have a negative outlook, but also Slovakia being present in one of the top most active countries, right? And this highlights the big issue that we see in the relationship, and that is that the poor institutionalization of the relationship leads to electoral volatility in how the relationship is evolving. Different political parties in individual countries have different priorities when it comes to their foreign policy and how they engage with external actors. So that, of course, creates changes in their attitude. Alfred has previously mentioned the study we published in early 2023 that was looking at the period of 2019 to 2022. At the time, Slovakia was number 2 overall across the whole Central and Eastern European region, and now it has dropped to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th place. So based on the patterns of engagement, not only the quantitative amount of relations, but also evaluating the individual types of engagements on a qualitative perspective, because of course, different types of engagements carry very different weight for the relationship. We've categorized all the countries that we evaluated into 4 broad categories, and we labeled them old partners, new friends, pragmatists, and laggards, really essentially based on how much of an activity we see both in the political as well as in the economic area. The old partners are countries that do have a rather longer term engagement with Taiwan, and the engagement is not really so much politically scrutinized domestically. Of course, there are ups and downs over time, but overall, the relationship sort of has its natural level and natural momentum. New friends are countries that are up and coming partners for Taiwan. They started to engage around 2020, 2021. That's when the big skyrocketing in the volume of engagement started to happen. And they do have quite robust political ties now, but of course, the economic relationship still needs to catch up a little bit to it. Right now, it's 3 countries that we have labeled as such: Poland, Czechia, Lithuania. Until 2023, we would have labeled Slovakia as well, but as I said, the relationship has lost its momentum under the current government, which has a very different approach how to engage Indo-Pacific, very much focused on engagement with the PRC. Hence, the drop down to the next category of pragmatists, countries that do wish to have beneficial economic ties, but for a variety of reasons don't engage on a political level, at least not openly. Of course, there are some political engagements that are happening not openly, but that in and of itself is a good proxy measure of the maturity of the relationship, whether you are willing to engage Taiwan openly as well. Last but not least, the Lagarde group, countries which have very little interactions, and with the one common thing that none of these countries has opened the representative office in Taiwan. Here we still also include countries like Latvia and Estonia, which are increasingly starting to engage with Taiwan, but they have not yet made this step into opening a representative office. Estonia being currently in negotiations on this point with Taiwan. So maybe in the next iteration of this study, we will have to upgrade it and we will see a positive story developing there. If we look back again on the quantitative and decompose it on the average volume per each category that I outlined, we see a very similar pattern. Very sharp uptake in engagements for EU institutions, old partners, and new friends in the past few years. Much less in the pragmatists and Lagarde group, but even there we see a slight uptake in the relationship. So this sort of Taiwan wave is something that has gone through the entire continent. Of course, in some countries we still have very minimal interactions, but in the group as such, there's growing engagements, and we will need to see how this relationship develops down the line, whether the momentum holds up for all the countries, whether it will start to go down, maybe in some of those categories, maybe it will level out at some point after the initial hype of 2022 has fallen off. So this is something we need to look into for the future. Mutual visits, that's a sort of pinnacle of engagements. Political delegations, similar story, both from Taiwan to EU and from EU to Taiwan, increasingly normalize the visits, typically up to the deputy minister level. Ministerial level visits from Europe to Taiwan or vice versa are still very rare. If we would look at European ministers traveling to Taiwan for official engagements, there have been only two such instances over the past years. German Minister of Education and Czech Ministry of Science. Even when Taiwanese ministers increasingly travel to Europe, it's rarely for official open discussions with the same level counterparts. It's usually more asymmetrical or limited to speaking at conferences, for example, which provide a good proxy for engagement in politically difficult environments. Similar decomposition per countries as we've seen in the overall relations. So I will just quickly outline what it looks like on a sectoral level, because this will feed very nicely into what the individual country presentations are going to mention. Relationship started to develop quite a bit on the political and security level. We have a growing set of binding agreements being signed by individual countries. Majority of European states now have opened or host themselves Taiwanese representative offices, but the momentum is slowing down. In 2003, the representative office in Slovakia opened, and then until 2021, nothing happened until the Lithuanian office opened, and now we have the negotiations about Estonia going on. Security cooperation, that's probably the most sensitive of these dimensions. That's also something that's increasingly happening, especially when it comes to soft security issues. Looking at economic security, for example, dealing with hybrid warfare. The global cooperation and training framework is a very useful platform for Taiwan in this regard, because it has allowed Taiwan to engage on security also with those countries that are otherwise very reluctant to engage. So even countries like Greece, for example, have engaged with Taiwan on security under the GCTF platform. Economic relations, EU is Taiwan's largest investor over the years, bigger than US. So that's very good news for us in Europe, that we are very much linked to Taiwan economically. A lot of that is driven by the semiconductor sector and adjacent sectors, but there are opportunities elsewhere as well. Nowadays, there's a lot of discussion, for example, with regards to security adjacent economic fields. So, for example, drone production cooperation, drone exports from Taiwan to Europe. Just last week, Economist ran a story about the fact that Czech Republic and Poland are now the global largest buyers of Taiwanese drones for their militaries, largely then providing them to Ukraine for its own defense efforts. Subnational and grassroots ties, also an important dimensions. I already touched up on university and think tank organized conferences as an important platform for semi-official engagements. But there are some aspects that are missing, and there's also one bullet point missing in my slide on city-to-city cooperation, which is also increasingly active. Right now, we have 27 cities and self-governing regions in Europe that have partnerships with Taiwanese counterparts, which is quite good as a conduit for relations. But if we contextualize it, for example, by comparing to US or to Japan, it is still very low. Japan itself has over 30 such partnerships and US over 100. Of course, there is one important link missing for establishing these types of partnerships, and that is that both in Japan and in the US, they are largely driven by local Taiwanese diasporas, which tend to be much smaller in Europe. But nevertheless, they offer a platform for future engagement. What is missing still is direct political party dialogues as a conduit for relations, for example, so that the real political ties don't have to develop only on the level of elected officials, but that the practical policy dialogue can happen with party staffers, for example, which would be a less sensitive way how to engage politically active Taiwanese citizens on matters where we can share learning experiences. So, with this in mind, we should think about how to make sure that the relationship, which has had a very rapid start, is future-proofed and remains sustainable. We propose 4 pillars along which the relations should be developing down the line. First one being economic resilience. One reason why European countries started to engage with Taiwan was a growing China fatigue and being tired of unfulfilled economic promises by China. And Taiwan needs to be wary of not going down the similar path. A lot of economic promises have been made in terms of investment into the semiconductor supply chains, for example, and those need to be delivered on now so that the similar Taiwan fatigue when it comes to economic relations doesn't set in. This require very stringent identification of overlapping economic interests, so that the relationship is based on a very practical reading of what each side has to offer to each other, which also means that we need to continue to remove some of the remaining market access barriers that can make it difficult to engage economically. Having this in mind, political signaling should still be an important aspect of the relationship. Symbolic diplomacy helps to keep Taiwan in the discourse, and that is very important for asserting Taiwan's sovereignty, Taiwan's presence in our international imagination, so that China's propaganda doesn't prevail over Taiwan's identity. This also requires trust building, so doing more 1.5 track dialogues and other forms of semi-official engagements where new ideas for cooperation can be brainstormed, when dirty laundry can be aired out behind closed doors so that we can focus on the positives of the relationship. And public diplomacy, of course. In most of Europe, we see public opinion about Taiwan improving. Parallel to this study, we ran a public opinion survey in 4 countries of Central Europe, in Slovakia, Czechia, Poland, and Hungary. And in each 4 of those, we've seen a very positive development compared to the survey we've done 5 years before. In case of Slovakia, for example, it was a increase in net favorability of Taiwan by 18 percentage points, for example. Quite a big change in favorability in a period of 5 years. What this favorability has not turned into yet would be support of local populations into support in case of Taiwan's trade contingency, in case of China's invasion of Taiwan. And this is the big homework for Taiwan down the line, working on transforming favorability into support. And I'm gonna stop here because I think that a lot of this can be painted with specific country case examples. So thank you for now, and happy to discuss any of this during Q&A.